This is the Ancient Texan. We're going to look at climate change again. Last time we looked at climate change, our policies, we first noted that climate change may not be the biggest problem we have to solve in the world. Maybe it's not an emergency. And even if we did say that climate change was the biggest problem in the world, maybe how we're spending our money isn't as good as it could be. We're going to look at those kind of ideas again and give you some examples of what's going on in the world. So we shouldn't be focused just here on the United States. We're going to look at population growth around the world, the Western world, Africa, a few places. See how that affects climate change and how that should affect our policies, unless we just want to be myopic. Focus here on the U.S. Anyways, this is the Ancient Texan. Hoping you'll listen and think about what I'm saying. It's not really important you listen to me, but the choices we are making right now in climate change have big impacts. And right now we've jumped off into a course of action without really doing much discussion. And I'm hoping that it's not too late for us to consider that we don't necessarily have a good plan, and we should start working on the plan before we start spending the money. And we should definitely start working on the plan before we start doing things that impacts the world in a negative manner. Well, this is the Ancient Texan. We're going to look at our climate policies while talking about Nigeria. That doesn't make sense, maybe on the surface. But climate change, global warming, if it's a problem, it's a global problem. And what happens in Nigeria doesn't stay in Nigeria. U.S. climate policy for the planet is we reduce CO2 by reducing the use of natural gas and coal, increasing the amount of wind and solar, and maybe using nuclear power. And we want to increase electric vehicles, subsidize them, put trillions of dollars in that direction. Trillion bucks. Is climate policy the best use of a trillion bucks? Well, that's a whole nother podcast. Is climate change the number one problem on the planet? Huh. And if climate change is the number one problem, is our policy the best use of money to reduce CO2? Eight billion people are on the planet right now. 2 decades, I'll be 10 billion, give or take a little. What you may not know is half of that increase will come from 8 countries, all of them in Africa. You may not also know that the Western world, most of US, Europe, even Latin America, a lot of Asia, especially China, is actually decreasing in population. Dramatically so in the case of China. China may have by 2050 halfish the number of people they have now. That's a whole another big subject. So the population in most of the world is going down, except in Africa, it's going up. And there's also places like India, Indonesia, Pakistan that's going up. But we're going to take one country and illustrate the problem. Nigeria is about 10% the physical size of the U.S., but it has 225 million people. We have 350 million people, but their population is doubling every 22 years. That is pretty amazing. They're one of the fastest growing populations in the world. Fertility rate of 5.7. How prosperous are they? They actually have the highest GDP in Africa. So I'm not picking one of the crummy little countries that is small and starving. I'm picking a big country that makes more oil in Africa than any other country in Africa. And their GDP is about per capita is about 2,400. Of course, that's very misleading because that's on average. They have a whole truckload of poor people. But their population is growing faster than their wealth. In other words, they're going backwards. And where do they get their energy? 76% is biomass. Oil is the second biggest energy source, with 10% coming from natural gas. And as we pointed out, Nigeria is the biggest oil producer in Africa. Well, when you say someone uses biomass, you say, well, that's cool. That could be recyclable. But if you cut down your forest and do not replant it, if you deforest the country, that is not called renewable energy. That's called deforestation. Nigeria has the highest rate of deforestation in the world. So we got the biggest oil producer in Africa getting most of their energy by cutting down forest and other biomass. They have a whole lot of areas that are protected, like our, national forest, that kind of thing, except nobody pays any attention to that. They're losing biodiversity and they're degrading their environment. Let's summarize. Nigeria has the highest rate of deforestation in the world because their population is exploding. They got plenty of oil and gas. How does all that fit together? Okay, they could use electricity, right? Well, their grid's no good. And they have limited transmission capacity. and their infrastructure basically sucks. Now, what's our advice to them? Well, we tell them not to cut down their forest. That's what they ought to quit doing that. Quit cutting down their forest. But these are hungry people that are starving. They need to stay warm at night. They need to cook their food, so they cut down the forest. They also make money by cutting down the forest and selling the wood. So what do we tell them? We tell them don't cut down the forest. Our advice is to stop cutting down their forest. Really? What did we do in America when we were in the same situation? Franklin Roosevelt established the Rural Electrification Administration, and we started putting electricity in the South, in particular and out west too, Dakota and other places, because our farms, the rural areas of our country, our farmland, only 10% of the farms had electricity. And what did we decide was the best thing to do? What raised them out of poverty? Nigeria is in exactly the same shape as we were in 1935. Of course, not exactly. Nothing's exactly. This is a picture from 1935 when a farmer gets electricity in his house. What makes sense for Nigeria for energy and for climate change? You want them to stop cutting down the forest? We need to give them another source of energy. We need to give them electricity. Now that can be powered by natural gas, which is probably the easiest and the fastest, coal, which is also fairly easy, doable, and that's the way China will do it when they come into Nigeria. You could even put in nuclear power plants, but we can't even do that in America. And you can put in, solar and wind. But if you want to do it in a timely fashion before their population just takes off and leaves you behind, I'd suggest you consider natural gas. See, because in Nigeria, they're not rich enough to worry about CO2. They're not cutting down forest because they don't like forest. They're cutting down forest because they need the energy and they need the wood to sell. And us telling them not to cut the wood down is a total waste of time. It's laughable. Now, what does it make sense for America with climate change? We're going to buy electric cars and that's going to fix things. What if you spent the same money for electrification of Nigeria and they stopped cutting down forest? Forest that's getting burned down and putting CO2 in the air, plus getting rid of a lot of animals. We could even throw in a few cities in Nigeria and help them get electricity. To me, it's almost laughable. If it wasn't so sad, we somehow think buying electric cars, and I have a plug-in hybrid. I do most of my driving around with electric, so I'm not against it. But do I think that's the best way to address climate change and CO2 putting into the air? Do I think the best use of money is here in the United States? We can afford to, to address climate change. But if we want to spend our bucks in the best possible way, it's not us buying electric cars. There's a whole thing that you buy electric cars um, that go 400 miles. The initial requirement for uh, lithium and mines and cobalt and stuff has a CO2 cost, startup cost, which we'll cover in another video. But just let's say that buying electric cars actually works with our current level of technology to reduce CO2. Do you think it works as well as not cutting down a forest? Do you think that the very incremental improvement that we get with electric cars, which is actually to be argued later, the $1 trillion that we're going to spend on subsidizing electric cars, it, it it's it's just ridiculous. Ridiculous. Look at Nigeria. Nigeria is just an example of what's happening in the planet. Our population is decreasing. Our demand, ours is flat right now, but most of the, you know, France and Europe and most of the world is actually Western world, any prosperous place, and China are all decreasing in population. Do you think our demands for power is going up or down as our population levels off and starts decreasing going forward? Do you think China, with their rapid decrease that's come in over the next 30 years in population, do you think their energy demand is going up or down? Now compare that to Nigeria that's doubling in population every 22 years. Compare that to Africa, 8 countries that are going to have 2 billion more people on the planet in the next 20 years. Actually, they only get 1 billion. The other billion goes to India, uh, Indonesia, and Pakistan, and a few other odds and ends. So, do you think we should spend the money for new energy in a place that's cutting down trees or a place that's buying electric cars? I mean, it's just it it's it should be so clear to everyone that this podcast should be trivial and we should instantly run out and change our American policy. I'm going to conclude this podcast putting it back to you. First, do you think climate change is the biggest problem facing humanity? Do you think it's existential? And if you do think that, Someone gave you the $1 trillion we're going to spend over the next couple of decades. Do you think it could make more impact on CO2 emissions in Nigeria or in the United States? Where do you think you could get the best bang for your buck? You think buying a bunch of electric cars with the grid that we have and the sources of our power, we still get 20 to 30% of our electricity from coal, and connect up electric car to a coal power plant? You think that's a good use of money? Or do you think maybe putting people in Nigeria on natural gas and taking away their dependence and burning down the forest, cutting it down? What do you think? I mean, you might need to do some sophisticated analysis, but I don't think so. I think this is pretty simple. Buying a lot of electric cars when we're still making electricity with coal, or helping some country burn natural gas instead of burning down the forest. Of course, we might do it just because we think they're as good as we are and what we did in America with rural electrification. What do you think? Do you think we should treat them like we treated ourselves? Do you think they deserve it? They don't deserve it, right? Because we want to buy some electric cars. They can keep on burning the forest down. How do you think that totals up on CO2 into the atmosphere, though? Nigeria is just one little country. I think it's about the size of Texas. Probably has an economy underneath the size of Texas. But it has almost as many people as America, and in a couple of decades will pass us. All those people will be crammed into one little country. Our population will be going down by then. Theirs will be shooting up. And I bet you the forest won't be in great shape by then. So if they put you in charge of $1 trillion to use in global warming, do you think you could find a better use for it than electric cars in the U.S.? This is just a first in a series of things we might do instead of buying electric cars. We're going to have some more on electric cars too. Anyway, this is the Ancient Texan. I want you to think about the politics of our climate change actions, the religion of our climate change policies. I want you to think about the plan we have and how well thought out it is. I want you to start thinking about what we're doing and if it makes sense. A lot riding on it, that we're spending our money well. And if we are, I'd love you to write me and explain how Nigeria and electric cars fit together, kind of the whole fuzzy mess. Anyway, this is the Ancient Texan. Hope you have a good one.
Namaste.